My cousin laughed at my little tech job and called me a joke, until the truth about my company made him the family embarrassment. The invitation came in the mail a month ago. An elegant, cream-colored envelope with gold trim, the kind that screamed wealth and formality, arrived from my aunt, the matriarch of our extended family. She was hosting one of her grand reunions at her massive estate. I hadn't been to one in years. Work kept me busy, and if I were being honest, I never saw much point in going. These gatherings were less about reconnecting and more about subtle and not-so-subtle competitions. Who had the best job, the biggest house, the most expensive car? I'm 32, and while my family never took me seriously, I've done pretty well for myself. I run a cybersecurity consulting firm specializing in data protection for mid-sized companies. It started as a small operation after I left my corporate job, but it grew quickly once we secured a few big contracts. But no one in my family knows that. They assume I barely scrape by, probably hopping from one gig to another. I never corrected them because, frankly, I didn't care what they thought. I wasn't interested in their approval or the exhausting games they played. Growing up, it was always about appearances and achievements. Most of my cousins followed predictable paths: law, medicine, finance. And then there was Mark. He was the golden boy, the one everyone measured themselves against, a corporate lawyer with a perfect resume. He'd always been arrogant, but it got worse over the years when I first decided not to go the traditional route. He mocked me relentlessly. "Not everyone is cut out for success," he told me once, laughing like it was just an objective fact. I never responded to his taunts. It was never worth the effort. My parents, unlike the rest of the family, knew about my success. They urged me to go to the reunion, saying it was time I showed them all, but I had no interest in proving anything. Still, after a lot of nudging, I gave in. Fine, I'd go. I'd show up, sit through the usual passive-aggressive conversations, and then leave. No drama. The reunion was set at my aunt's sprawling estate, a mansion with marble floors, grand chandeliers, and staff serving drinks on silver trays. I arrived in my regular car, nothing flashy. Most of my family had arrived in luxury vehicles, stepping out in tailored suits and designer dresses. A few glanced my way, offered half-hearted greetings, then moved on. No surprise there. Dinner was held in a grand dining hall, long tables set with expensive china. The conversation was exactly what I expected: promotions, investments, extravagant vacations. Mark was in his element, holding court with a group of cousins who hung on his every word. It didn't take long before he turned his attention to me. "So," he said, swirling his wine glass, "you still struggling to pay rent, or have you finally found a real job?" A few chuckles followed. No one outright laughed, but no one stopped him either. It was how things worked in this family, mockery disguised as casual conversation. I didn't react. I never did. "I'm doing all right," I said, pouring myself some water. Mark smirked. "That's just another way of saying no. You know, I could help you out if you need connections. It's never too late to start over." I shrugged, and that only made him bolder. With a few drinks in him, he got louder. "See, this is what happens when people don't take their careers seriously. Not everyone can be successful. Some people just, well, you know." The room went quiet. Even my aunt, who usually encouraged these little social battles, seemed uncomfortable. My parents looked furious, but they knew better than to start something. I stayed calm. I always did. Then my younger cousin, probably the only one there without an agenda, turned to me. "What do you actually do?" I kept it simple. "I work in tech," I said. "I do pretty well," Mark scoffed. "That's just code for unemployed." More chuckles, a few exchanged looks, some amused, some pitying. Mark leaned back in his chair, completely smug. "Man, I hope you're at least saving up. Maybe in a few years you'll finally be able to buy a house." I could have said a lot of things. I could have told them about the business, the investments, the multiple properties. But where was the fun in that? Instead, I smirked and said, "If you really think that, I guess we'll see." Mark laughed, thinking he'd won. I just let him. This was going to be interesting. The morning after the dinner, I woke up early and went downstairs for breakfast. My parents were already there, sitting at a large dining table filled with fresh fruit, pastries, and just about every breakfast option you could imagine. Most of the family hadn't come down yet, but I could hear voices from the next room. Mark was there, loud as ever, holding court with a few uncles. He was bragging about his latest courtroom victory, something about a high-profile corporate case that only someone with real skill could handle. The way he talked, you'd think he had personally rewritten the entire legal system. I ate quietly while my parents exchanged glances. They didn't say anything, but I could tell they were waiting for something to happen. My father sipped his coffee, clearly enjoying the show unfolding in the next room. Then my uncle, the investor in the family, started talking about a tech startup he had been following. He was impressed with how fast it had grown and mentioned that it was on track for a massive expansion soon. I kept eating, not saying a word. Mark, of course, didn't miss a chance to throw in his opinion. He dismissed the entire tech industry as overhyped and said most startups were just lucky flukes that burned out in a few years. He had no idea the company my uncle was talking about was mine. Not long after, Mark started making his usual passive-aggressive comments. He made some remark about how some people wasted their potential chasing pointless dreams instead of securing a stable career. No names were mentioned, but it was obvious who he was talking about. A few minutes later, Mark and some of the older cousins started organizing a golf outing. It was their usual networking thing, a chance to show off, make connections, and talk business. Mark made it clear I wasn't invited. He played it off casually, saying it was more of a professional gathering, nothing I would find interesting. I didn't care. I wasn't interested in spending a whole day listening to them stroke each other's egos, but I decided to tag along anyway, just to watch the show. At the golf course, Mark was in his element, bragging about all the high-level people he knew. He dropped names, exaggerated stories, and acted like he was the most important person there. Everything was going as usual, until an unexpected guest arrived. During the conversation, one of my investors, a well-known business executive, happened to be on the same course. He spotted me from a distance and gave me a nod of recognition before casually mentioning how well my company was doing in an industry discussion, catching my family's attention. He mentioned how excited he was about our upcoming expansion and hinted at some major deals in the works. Mark froze. He didn't say a word at first, just stared like he couldn't process what was happening. The rest of the group went silent too. They weren't used to seeing someone important giving me that kind of recognition. Then the questions started. My uncle, who had barely paid attention to me the night before, suddenly perked up. They started asking about my company, my work, what exactly I did. I kept my answers simple. I didn't brag, didn't try to prove anything, just gave them the facts. But the more I talked, the more interested they became. Mark, still trying to hold on to some sense of control, attempted to brush it off. He said startups fail all the time, that success in tech is mostly luck, and that it was nothing compared to a stable, prestigious career like his. I let him talk. Then, casually, I mentioned my company's valuation. The number was in the millions. The entire group went silent. A few people looked genuinely shocked, while others tried to hide their reactions. My uncle, the investor, nodded slowly, clearly reevaluating everything he had assumed about me. The executive, still standing next to me, added another detail. He confirmed that my company was growing fast, had serious backing, and was projected to double in value soon. He even mentioned that other investors were eager to get in before it was too late. Mark's face turned red. He looked like he had just been punched in the gut. For the first time, he had nothing to say. My parents stayed quiet, but I caught my father smirking behind his coffee cup. My mother simply folded her hands in her lap, looking completely at peace. No one said anything for a long moment. Then one of my uncles cleared his throat and changed the subject, but the energy had shifted. Mark wasn't the center of attention anymore, and he knew it. Later that night, the atmosphere at the family gathering had changed. Conversations that used to be about real estate, investments, and law firm promotions had shifted. More relatives were coming up to me, asking about my company, my work, how I got started. Some were just curious. Others were clearly kicking themselves for not taking me seriously before. Mark, on the other hand, was still trying to regain control. He made offhand remarks about tech startups being unstable, how most of them crash within a few years, how real wealth comes from established industries. He threw in a few stories about failed startups he had read about, subtly trying to paint a picture that my success was temporary at best. But it wasn't working. His usual confidence had a slight edge of frustration now. The same people who used to nod along when he talked were now more interested in what I had to say. A couple of my uncles even started asking if I had investment opportunities open. Mark tried to steer the conversation back to himself, mentioning his latest big case, but the excitement wasn't there anymore. He was still respected, but not idolized the way he used to be. Then, the moment that shifted, everything happened. One of my younger cousins, who had been quiet most of the night, suddenly asked Mark how much he made a year. Mark didn't hesitate. He proudly gave the number, expecting the usual admiration. Before anyone could respond, another relative, someone who had been listening closely all evening, casually said, "That's probably what your company makes in a month." Silence. Mark laughed, but it was forced, a tight, uncomfortable chuckle. His fiancée, who had been sitting beside him, shifted slightly, pressing her lips together like she wished she were anywhere else. A few people exchanged glances. Someone tried to move the conversation forward, but Mark wasn't letting it go. He leaned forward, making sure everyone heard him, as he insisted that most of my company's success must have come from investors, that I was probably just lucky to be in the right place at the right time. That was when the investor, the same executive from earlier, spoke up again. Actually, he built this company from the ground up. He's one of the sharpest business minds I've seen. Another silence. This time, it wasn't awkward, it was realization. I could see it happening, the shift in perception. Some family members who had dismissed me before started to show a bit more interest, asking casual questions about my work. A few were still skeptical, but the dynamic had noticeably shifted. The way they looked at me had changed, as if they were finally seeing me for the first time. Mark's face was red. He barely held it together before suddenly standing up. He muttered something about needing to check emails and left the gathering without another word. His fiancée hesitated for a second before quietly following him. As soon as they were out of sight, the whispers started. A couple of my aunts exchanged knowing looks. One of them muttered that Mark had always been like this. Another relative, someone who had once hung on to his every word, shook their head and said, "I never realized how arrogant he was. I didn't react. I didn't have to." A little later, while I was getting a drink, Mark's fiancée approached me. She looked hesitant but serious. She apologized for Mark's behavior, saying he wasn't handling things well. She admitted that he had always felt superior to me, and that seeing the family's reaction tonight had shaken him more than he would ever admit. I didn't gloat. I just shrugged and told her, "It's fine, he'll figure things out eventually." That night, Mark didn't show up again, but I overheard some cousins talking in hushed voices, saying he had been venting to them. He was still trying to convince himself that my success wasn't real, that it was overhyped and not sustainable. The same excuses people make when they realize they bet on the wrong horse. The next morning, one of my relatives posted a subtle social media update about the reunion. Nothing too obvious, but the message was clear. Something about how some people should be careful who they underestimate. The comments started rolling in. Some were lighthearted, others a little sharper, but one thing was obvious. Mark wasn't the one people were admiring anymore. Mark showed up to breakfast the next morning, looking exhausted. His usual confidence was replaced with something more controlled, like he was trying to keep himself in check. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't say anything directly, but his irritation was obvious. While I sat with my parents, casually sipping my coffee, I caught sight of Mark off to the side, speaking in hushed tones with a few older relatives. It was clear he was working on damage control, probably trying to spin a new version of events. A few nods, some murmured agreements. It didn't take much to see where this was going. As the morning went on, the divide in the family became more noticeable. Some of my relatives, particularly the younger ones, were openly impressed by my success. They asked more questions, genuinely interested in my work. A couple of uncles, the ones who always put Mark on a pedestal, had shifted their approach too, suddenly acting like they had always believed in me. But then there were the others, the ones who had always sided with Mark. They weren't outright hostile, but they made their opinions known. "Money does not equal respect," one of them muttered at the table. Another made a comment about how real success is about legacy, not numbers. Then Mark's mother got involved. She was never outright rude, but she had a way of making passive-aggressive comments sound polite. She talked about how humility is more important than wealth, and how some people lose sight of what really matters. She never said my name, but she didn't have to. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Mark's fiancée sat next to him, looking increasingly uncomfortable. She wasn't speaking much, mostly just picking at her food, while Mark kept throwing out backhanded comments. It was clear that last night had rattled him, and he was still grasping for a way to regain control. Then, without warning, Mark snapped. He turned toward me, voice sharp enough to cut through the room's chatter. He accused me of hiding my success, of deliberately keeping it a secret just to make the family look foolish. He demanded to know why I never mentioned anything, why I let everyone believe I was struggling when in reality I was doing better than most of them. I set my cup down, let the silence stretch for a moment, then simply said, "You embarrassed yourself." A few people inhaled sharply. Mark's jaw clenched. Then an uncle, one of the few in the family who had never really taken sides, spoke up. He leaned back in his chair, looked Mark straight in the eye, and said, "Jealous of what? He is doing better than all of us." Mark's entire argument crumbled right there. He tried to recover, to spin it again, but the shift in the room was undeniable. Some of the same people he'd been whispering to earlier were now avoiding eye contact. No one was nodding along anymore. The weight of the moment was sinking in for everyone. In a final desperate attempt, Mark scoffed and said, "Let's see where you are in 5 years." I shrugged. "I'll be fine." I have investments ensuring financial stability for decades." And then, finally, his fiancée snapped. She turned to him, voice sharp with frustration, and told him to stop embarrassing himself. The entire room went silent. Mark's face darkened. He didn't argue, didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he pushed his chair back, stood up, and left the table without another word. Later that afternoon, a cousin pulled me aside with an amused look. Apparently, Mark had been going around, asking different relatives if they really knew what my business was about. He was fishing for anything he could use against me, trying to find some angle to discredit my success. No one took the bait. If anything, they found it entertaining. Then, a few hours later, Mark made a vague post on social media, something about how some people think money makes them better, but real success is about respect and legacy. It didn't mention me by name, but it didn't need to. The timing was obvious. The post got a few polite likes, mostly from the same relatives who had always sided with him, but no one engaged with it. A few family members even shared unrelated posts right after, effectively pushing it out of view. It was clear that most people weren't interested in entertaining his narrative anymore. As the evening rolled in, I stepped outside for some fresh air. That was when Mark found me. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. His face was tense, and his voice was low, like he was barely holding himself together. He accused me of turning the family against him, of making him look like a fool in front of everyone. I just looked at him and said, "You did that yourself." That was it. No argument, no debate, just the truth. He stared at me for a moment, like he was waiting for me to say more. When I didn't, he turned and walked off, muttering something under his breath. Not long after, my father called a family meeting. It wasn't anything formal, just a gathering in the main living room where most of the relatives were already sitting and chatting. The growing tension had become too obvious to ignore, and my father decided to address it directly. Mark tried to play the victim. He claimed I had humiliated him first, that I had been hiding my success just to embarrass him. He looked around the room, waiting for support. He didn't get it. One of my aunts shook her head and reminded everyone that Mark had been mocking me for years. Another uncle pointed out how Mark had been the one making dismissive comments about startups and acting like I was some kind of failure. A few younger cousins laughed, saying it was funny how Mark could dish it out but couldn't take it. Mark's parents jumped in, trying to defend him. His mother insisted that he was being misunderstood, that he was just feeling pressured because the family was suddenly changing how they saw things. But no one was buying it. Then came the real blow. His fiancée, who had been sitting quietly during most of this, finally spoke up. She looked exhausted, like she had been holding something back for too long. And then she said it. She needed some space. The room went completely silent. Mark stiffened. He looked at her, then at the family, then back at her. He opened his mouth to say something but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he just nodded, turned around, and walked out of the room. He didn't say another word. Within an hour, Mark was gone. He packed up his things and left the reunion early, not bothering to say goodbye to anyone. A few relatives tried to act like it was no big deal, but the whispers started almost immediately. People were speculating about his engagement. Some thought the relationship wouldn't last. Others just shook their heads, saying they never realized how fragile Mark's ego really was. The next morning, I found out Mark had unfollowed me on every platform. No messages, no final words, just a quiet attempt to erase me from his circle. I wasn't surprised. With Mark gone, the rest of the reunion was actually enjoyable. The tension had lifted, and for the first time in years, the gathering didn't feel like a competition. Conversations flowed easily, laughter came naturally, and people started treating each other like family instead of rivals. It was ironic. Mark had always wanted to be the center of attention, the one everyone looked up to, but the moment he left, things got better for everyone. With Mark gone, the atmosphere at the reunion shifted entirely. Conversations were lighter, people were actually enjoying themselves, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a constant competition. A few relatives even joked about how much more peaceful everything was without him there. At one point, Mark's fiancée found me again, looking more frustrated than before. She admitted that his behavior over the past few months had been making her reconsider their future, and the reunion had only confirmed her doubts. She had always known he had an ego, but seeing how he dismissed and undermined others, even in front of family, made her realize how much of a problem it really was. By the time the reunion wrapped up, the gossip had spread. Word got around that after leaving, Mark had a full meltdown at his parents' house. He argued with his parents, furious that they didn't defend him more. Apparently, he felt betrayed that the family didn't rally behind him the way they used to. Despite everything, he never reached out. No apology, no attempt to smooth things over, just radio silence. If anything, it seemed like he doubled down on his bitterness. A week later, more news came in. Mark's fiancée officially ended the engagement. She cited his ego problem as the main reason, saying she couldn't be with someone who was more obsessed with his own image than the people around him. Then a cousin who worked in the legal field mentioned that Mark had gotten into an argument at work. He had lashed out at a colleague and ended up getting written up by his firm. It wasn't a huge career-ending scandal, but it was another crack in the perfect image he had built for himself. His reputation within the family crumbled fast. The same relatives who once saw him as the family's golden boy were now keeping their distance. Some of them even admitted they had always found him a little exhausting but never said anything before. His parents, on the other hand, were furious. They tried to shift the blame onto me, claiming that I had set him up to look bad, but no one was buying it. The reality was too obvious. Mark had done it to himself. Privately, my parents admitted they were proud. My father, usually the quiet one, actually smirked and said he enjoyed watching me finally put Mark in his place. My mother just nodded, saying it had been a long time coming. Meanwhile, Mark tried to salvage what he could. He unfollowed nearly every family member who had sided with me, and suddenly started posting about humility and learning from mistakes. He even rebranded himself online, talking about personal growth and becoming a better person. No one bought it. While Mark's world was shrinking, mine was expanding. My company finalized a major partnership, and the deal was publicly announced, gaining a lot of attention in the industry. Some of the same relatives who once dismissed me were now reaching out, asking for business advice. A few weeks later, another family gathering was held. This time, Mark wasn't invited. No one even suggested including him. As I looked around at the people laughing, chatting, and actually enjoying themselves, it became clear Mark had spent years trying to control how the family saw him, but in the end, the only thing he had really controlled was his own downfall. The best revenge wasn't proving anything to him. It was simply succeeding and moving forward. Mark's downfall wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, messy, and completely self-inflicted. After being ignored by most of the family, he turned to social media, posting vague messages about fake people and how family is supposed to be supportive. The bitterness was obvious. He never mentioned me directly, but anyone who had been at the reunion knew exactly who he was talking about. At first, some relatives reacted to his posts, trying to be neutral, leaving a few supportive comments. But as he kept going, posting about how people change when money is involved, and how real success isn't about wealth but character, even those started disappearing. He was making it clear he had no intention of letting this go, and people were getting tired of it. Relatives who once admired him started quietly distancing themselves. Aunts and uncles who had always taken his side stopped engaging. Even a few cousins who used to be close to him stopped liking his posts altogether. No one wanted to be involved in whatever this was turning into. Then the professional fallout started. A cousin who worked in the legal field mentioned that Mark had been butting heads with a few colleagues recently. His confidence, once seen as an asset, had started rubbing people the wrong way, and there were murmurs that he needed to dial it back. It wasn't a good look. On top of that, he'd been clashing with colleagues, pushing back against any feedback, acting like he was untouchable. The firm was now considering letting him go. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Mark tried reaching out to some family members, looking for sympathy. He called a few uncles, trying to spin the situation in his favor, making it seem like he was the real victim. But most of them had already moved on. Some ignored him completely, others gave vague, non-committal responses before changing the subject. He wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. Then he tried a different angle. He contacted my parents. He told them they needed to talk to me and convince me to stop making him look bad, insisted that I had embarrassed him in front of the entire family and that I needed to fix things. My parents didn't entertain it. They told him bluntly that I hadn't done anything to him. He had done it to himself. That was when I got an email. Mark sent me a message with a subject line that simply read, "We need to talk." The body of the email was a long, rambling explanation of how things had gotten out of hand and how we should clear the air. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of anything he had done, just an attempt to reset things on his terms. I responded with one sentence, "Mark, your problems are not my responsibility." That was the last time he tried to contact me directly, but the hits kept coming for him. Word spread that his former fiancée had moved on. She had started dating someone else, and people who had seen her recently said she looked much happier. That news alone seemed to set him off because soon after he started demanding she return the engagement ring. She refused. She told him that the ring was a gift, that it was hers to keep. That only made him angrier, and he started ranting about how she had betrayed him. But by then, she wasn't listening. She had already blocked him on everything. His mother tried one last time to shift the blame. She started telling relatives that I had ruined Mark's life, that my success had made him look bad, that I had humiliated him in front of the family. But no one was buying it. Everyone had seen the way he had acted. There was nothing to defend. Then came a setback for Mark. One of his clients decided not to renew their contract. A cousin mentioned that Mark's increasingly combative attitude at work had started raising concerns, and his firm was keeping a closer eye on him. Losing a client that important sent a clear message to his firm. It wasn't just a personal issue anymore. It was affecting business. Rumors started circulating that his boss was planning to fire him. At this point, even Mark seemed to realize things were falling apart. He made one last vague social media post about how some people only care about money. Unlike before, no one reacted, no likes, no comments, no engagement. No one cared anymore. The news spread quickly. Mark had been fired. A cousin confirmed that his law firm had finally let him go after multiple warnings about his attitude and poor handling of clients. It wasn't a sudden decision. His firm had been keeping an eye on him for months, and losing a major client had sealed his fate. His downfall had been a slow, self-inflicted disaster. With no job, Mark's online presence became even more erratic. His once carefully curated social media, filled with posts about his high-powered career, transformed into vague messages about betrayal, starting over, and how loyalty means nothing anymore. Unlike before, where he would get engagement from family and acquaintances, his posts were now met with silence. Then came the most ridiculous part. His parents, who had spent years enabling his arrogance, started reaching out, not to him, but to my parents. They asked if I could help Mark get back on his feet. Maybe I had connections. Maybe I could find him something in a corporate setting. After all, family helps each other, right? My response was simple, not my problem. That was the last time the topic was brought up in my house. Meanwhile, Mark's ex was moving on, publicly and happily. A few days after Mark lost his job, she posted pictures from a vacation with her new boyfriend. The difference was obvious. She looked relaxed, carefree. There was no forced perfection, no need to maintain an image. She had completely detached from the mess Mark had created. Shortly after those posts, Mark disappeared from social media for a few days. No vague messages, no attempts to frame himself as the victim, just silence. But silence didn't mean change. Mark started reaching out to old friends, pretending as if nothing had happened. He sent messages as if he hadn't spent years looking down on them, ignoring them, acting as if he was above them. Some didn't bother responding. Others sent polite but brief replies before cutting the conversation short. He had burned too many bridges, and now that he needed those same people, they weren't interested. The next family gathering happened soon after. For the first time, Mark wasn't invited. No one even debated it. There was no discussion, no last-minute decision. He was simply left out. It was an unspoken agreement among everyone that things were better without him there. The gathering went smoothly, no passive-aggressive remarks, no unnecessary tension. Conversations were natural, relaxed. It was the kind of family event that hadn't existed in years. A few days later, a cousin mentioned that Mark had applied for a job at a different law firm. It wasn't a prestigious one, not the kind he used to brag about. It was a lower-paying job, a step down from everything he had claimed to be, and he was rejected. Then the final attempt came. A long, rambling message from Mark landed in my inbox. He blamed me for everything, losing his job, losing his fiancée, being cut off from the family. He accused me of turning people against him, of humiliating him on purpose. He painted himself as the victim, acting as if I had personally orchestrated his downfall. I didn't respond. I blocked him instead. That was the moment it became final. No more second chances, no more connections. Whatever relationship had existed before was gone. The relief among the family was noticeable. Some relatives admitted they had been waiting for this moment for years. Without Mark stirring up conflict, things felt easier, more natural. His mother, refusing to accept reality, kept making excuses. She told people he was taking time to reflect, as if this was some sort of planned break. But no one believed her. They had seen too much. His father, on the other hand, saw the truth. At one of the last family events, someone quietly asked if Mark was okay. His father just sighed and said, "He did this to himself." After that, Mark started fading from view. His once daily social media posts became rare. He stopped trying to reclaim his former image, realizing that no one was paying attention anymore. Meanwhile, my company hit another milestone, record profits, a new expansion, something that, under normal circumstances, would have driven Mark crazy if he knew. But none of it mattered anymore. With him out of my life, I kept moving forward, and I had no intention of looking back. Months passed, and just when it seemed like Mark had finally learned his lesson, he attempted a comeback. He started posting on social media again, acting as if nothing had happened. Gone were the bitter rants and vague complaints. Now his posts were about growth and moving forward. He shared motivational quotes, talked about learning from failures, and even started posting about career tips, despite the fact that he had lost his once prestigious job. But no one cared. His posts barely got any engagement. The family had completely moved on. Where once his updates would be met with admiration and praise, now they were mostly ignored. A few distant acquaintances liked a couple of his posts out of politeness. But the people who truly knew him, his former inner circle, stayed silent. Mark's new reality was unavoidable. He no longer had the high-paying job, the admiration of his peers, or the fiancée he once flaunted. The prestige he had spent years carefully building had crumbled, and now he was left trying to piece together something from the wreckage. At the next family gathering, his parents showed up without him. It was the first time in years that they had attended without making excuses for him or trying to paint him as the golden child. When someone subtly brought up Mark's situation, his father just sighed and said, "He did this to himself." That was it. No defense, no sugarcoating, just the truth. Not long after, it was confirmed Mark had taken a job at a much smaller law firm. The salary was a significant step down from what he used to brag about, and the position wasn't anywhere near as prestigious. A cousin who still worked in the same industry mentioned that Mark had been humbled by how few options he had. He had spent years acting as if he was irreplaceable, and now he was learning the hard way that he wasn't. The family had moved past him entirely. Conversations no longer included him, not even in passing. When his name did come up, it was in a vague, dismissive way, like an afterthought, not someone worth discussing. Then his last desperate move. Even though I had already blocked him, he tried interacting with my social media in other ways. He started liking comments from mutual acquaintances, responding to posts made by relatives who still spoke to me, almost as if he was trying to get my attention indirectly. It didn't work. Frustrated, he made one last bitter post, a long-winded message about how people only support you when you're at the top, and how some family members are only happy when you fail. Instead of sympathy, it completely backfired. The comment section wasn't filled with concern, it was filled with mockery. People called him out, reminding him of how he had treated others. Some left laughing emojis. A few relatives who had kept quiet until now openly told him that he had no one to blame but himself. Realizing he was only embarrassing himself, Mark deleted everything. His entire attempt at reclaiming his image vanished overnight, then his final attempt at contact. He asked a cousin to pass a message to me, saying that we needed to talk. The cousin didn't even hesitate before responding, "Dude, he does not care about you anymore. Move on." That was the last anyone heard of Mark trying to reconnect. He finally faded into obscurity, no longer trying to force himself back into the family dynamic, no more desperate posts, no more bitter messages, just silence. Meanwhile, I focused on the people who actually mattered. I hosted a dinner with the relatives who had been supportive throughout everything. A real gathering with no competition, no passive-aggressive remarks, no pressure to prove anything, just genuine conversation and laughter. Mark had spent years trying to control how the family saw him. He had built his life around status, around making sure he was always at the top. But in the end, none of it mattered. Now he was nothing more than a bad memory, and I was thriving, surrounded by people who actually cared.